everybody, welcome back to my channel. It's a rainy and dreary day today, so today I thought I would talk about rereading books. At first I was just going to list all of the books I reread and why, and books that I would possibly want to reread again, but I thought I could use the opportunity to help give tips on why you should reread books. So that's how I'm framing this video instead of me just ranting about the books that I've reread because I'm an obsessive crazy person. So the first set of books I'm going to talk about, and the first reason I'm going to give, is I reread due to comfort and nostalgia. I reread a lot of books that I first enjoyed as a child or a teenager. I like enjoying going back to them and feeling familiar stories and characters and plot lines and not being overwhelmed by surprises or twists or anything, just sort of enjoying going back to what I used to read as a young child. It's also fun to go back to the parts in the stories you read when you were younger that like completely rocked your world and surprised you, and just getting to reread it again, remembering all of those memories that it gave you in the first place. So for me, that includes the Darkest Powers trilogy by Kelly Armstrong. She is a Canadian author, and these are paranormal romance books. They are about a young girl who finds out she's a necromancer, and she's staying at this home for troubled teens, which turns out to be a home for people who they test supernatural powers, and they end up escaping. I remember the series just rocking my world when I was a teenager. I remember reading them during class time silent reading, and one of the twists in the first book, I had to sit there with like my mouth covered by my hand because I was just so shocked by what happened, and I just remember loving that feeling of being so surprised and scandalized by the twist. Another book that I used to read over and over again is this Princess Diaries Omnibus by Meg Cabot. This is the first 3 books in one book. As you can see, I read it a lot. It's pretty broken. I actually used to have a loft bunk bed that was just the top bunk, and I used to read this before bed at night just to feel some comfort before sleep, and I used to toss it off of that bunk to the floor below. So that's why the book's like this. Treat your books a bit nicely, but just remember any wear and tear in your books was out of love and not out of malintent, though mine was pretty violent. It was just a book series that I loved so much as a child turning into a teenager that I would reread these books just to feel a sense of comfort, and I read it a lot during the 8th grade up until high school just to have a sense of comfort before I fell asleep. So one reason to reread books is to tap into your nostalgia or just have a sense of comfort in the familiar. The next reason why I reread books, a lot of it was reading it for class. In university, I took a lot of classics courses as my electives, and I had to read the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, I'd say 5 times each for separate courses. I had to read them so much that I actually went to a used bookstore and purchased the version that my professor always recommended for his classes outright, so I had to stop borrowing them from the bookstore and the library. I have my own copies now that I get to own forever. A lot of parts of them are even annotated to fit with my studies. Like here, I was discussing how a story told by one of the characters relates to the characters directly. Luckily, I didn't hate either of these stories, and each time I had to reread them, it was either in sections or for a different context for the class. So I was glad to learn more about these stories, about these poems, through different contexts for the course. For example, I did a classics course about fantasy in the modern imagination and in the ancient imagination, and I got to read the Odyssey looking for fantastical and even sci-fi elements, so that was a very, very interesting reason to reread parts of the poem. And I also just wanted to point out that sometimes you will have to reread books for school, no matter what major, and just to take it in stride. If you don't want to reread the whole thing, you don't have to, but just try to reread it with the context of the course in mind, and try to go in a little bit fresh, or try to go in with a fresh new vision. I promise it's not as bad as it seems, because I had to read the Iliad like 5 times, and I had to read the Odyssey like 4 or 5 times. So I've been there. Try not to get too frustrated if your professor double books the book, you know? Now, this next reason for rereading books is actually the opposite, or the inverse of what I was just talking about. because sometimes I wanted to reread a book outside of my class's context so I could look at it with fresh eyes outside of the academic lens. So for these books, I read Dracula by Bram Stoker for a book report and a speech that I did in grade 7, and I read Frankenstein and Pride and Prejudice. I read Frankenstein in high school for a book report, and I read Pride and Prejudice for a university class. I also read Frankenstein for that same university class. And then different times all through my life, I reread them all individually outside of those courses, just so I could really get my full perspective of these books. I understand that there has been a years-long debate on whether an English class assigning a book can ruin the book for students because they don't want to look at it with such a heavy, detailed lens focused on themes and comparison and differences and character arcs and such things. And I do understand the argument. However, I do think that people should reread these books again outside of the context of being forced to write a pretty boring essay. I understand high school essays are pretty standard 5 paragraphs, very boring, little wiggle room for anything interesting. And even papers I had to write in university for English, I just sort of farted out in like 2 nights, and I got really good marks on them just because it was that easy to replicate an English essay. So I do understand how viewing a certain book in an academic lens can just be boring and kill the whole vibe for you, but I do recommend returning back to some of those books that you read in school, reading them without the idea that you have to compare and contrast themes for an exam or a paper, and just seeing how they are as books themselves. I've been reading a lot of classics for my 100 Epic Reads of a Lifetime poster, and I feel that reading them outside of my high school context is a bit easier for me to get through them and to understand them. The next reason why I reread books is a pretty standard one, and I'm sure everybody's done this, but it is to reread a mystery or thriller, knowing the twist, and sort of rereading it back to check up on the details that you might have missed that helped foreshadow those events. Now, I don't read mystery thrillers too often. I find they're pretty standard and predictable, and I get a little bit bored if they're too predictable, but if they're too out there, I get thrown off, and then the book kind of falls flat for me just because I didn't see it coming. I'm a very complicated person, as you can tell, so there are very few mystery thrillers that I feel really capture my attention and turn out to be one of my favorites, but I reread Gone Girl a lot. I really like Gone Girl. I love the film. I can quote the film. I love both the film and the book so much, and I've reread this book multiple times just to see all the little hints that they drop, to see who's telling the truth when, who's lying when, who's the reliable narrator and who isn't, and viewing Nick through new eyes once you know the ending of the novel. One time I even reread through the book just reading Amy's diary entries because I find them more interesting than Nick's, even though she made it that way. So that is another reason to reread books. That's a pretty simple reason. Another reason to reread books, it's the most obvious answer I can give. It's the one that's like, duh, this is the only reason why I reread books. It's because they're your favorites, of course. So for me, that's most of the shelves that you can see behind me, that being The Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice. That includes The Raven Cycle by Maggie Stiefvater, If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. That includes Down the Rabbit Hole by Holly Madison. It's just more fun to reread a favorite and just, relish in the fact that you were right, that this is a favorite book, that the book was amazing, that your tastes are awesome, and you can just enjoy going back into the world again and all the characters and the plot points that you love, or the interesting facts and stories that you read from nonfiction. I just love going back to my favorites and rereading them and just being reminded why I loved them so much. Now, there's one of these favorites that I didn't mention in that list earlier that I wanted to specifically highlight because I understand that this book is pretty split in being either well loved or well detested, and I kind of want to vouch for it and definitely vouch for a reread for it. I feel like people need to reread it, and that is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. So many people were convinced to check out this book because of, I'm just gonna say it, the dark academia aesthetic, because of Tumblr, because of all the photo sets, gift sets, fan casts, all the poetic language that we isolate from it for our posts, all the discussions of it, all the themes, all the potential darkness in it. Everyone likes to make this book seem like it's so dark and so dreamy and so just utterly dark academia, and I want to argue that a lot of people sort of get ruined by that idea. They read this book and it's not what they pictured in their head. It's not the vibes or the aesthetic they were looking for. They get frustrated at how slow and dull it is, and they sort of don't give it a chance anymore, and they just sort of pass it off as boring and just not what they were expecting. I know this quite familiarly because I too felt this way when I first read it. I first read the book in 2016. I only ended up giving it maybe 2.5 or 3 stars just because I didn't get it. I thought the book dragged so much, and I thought that we were going to get a lot more cool darkness and poetic language and murder and just these dark vibes, this spooky artsy sort of thing. I thought we were going to get the true dark academia book, and I was disappointed that I didn't. But I then reread the book in 2019. I fully went back into it, dropping that idea from my head, dropping the expectations of what I had for this book, totally drinking in every single part that just dragged on, every dreary moment, every shitty act that the characters did, every goddamn time they pulled into the Burger King parking lot to do coke, and just took it all in stride, and now this is one of my favorite novels of all time. I dropped all of my expectations of it first read, and I really got into it in my reread, and now I just appreciate it for what it is. It's not dull to me, it's not slow, it does not drag on, and people who rag too much on the characters being bad people, that's the point! That's the point! They're supposed to be bad people. The book would be really boring if they were all very nice. And I also argue that this book lies to you on the back cover. It says, under the influence of their charismatic classics professor, a group of clever, eccentric misfits at an elite New England college discover a way of thinking and living that is a world away from the humdrum existence of their contemporaries. That's a lie. They're barely under the influence of their charismatic classics professor. I argue he hardly does much. They do this to their own damn selves. They try to find a way to do what they do in this book on their own by their own damn selves. And I just feel like that is not what the book is really about. That synopsis makes it seem more cult-like, makes it seem like they're more directly following orders of what Julian is telling them, but Julian is teaching them normal classics. He's teaching them normally. It's a bit close-knit, and it's a bit more private, and he's a bit more eccentric, but he's not literally swaying them into evil. He's not handing them all knives and telling them to go sacrifice things or whatever, which is what this sort of implies on the back of the book. No, he's not doing that, and I argue that that affects the way some people go into this book. So I highly suggest rereading The Secret History, getting all those expectations, throwing them out the window, expecting to hate the characters, to think a lot of it drags on after a certain plot point, and to just accept the acts and the characters of the novel as is and try to enjoy it on its own. Like, this book isn't a cool photo set on Tumblr. It's a book with characters that, you know, they're weird and they're funny and there's a lot going on, and I really love this book and I would love to see more people give it a second chance. Okay, I felt like I didn't really, explain myself well there, so I hope my ideas do come across. I'm going to end this video now listing books that I personally want to reread and give a second chance that I haven't yet. So firstly, I want to reread Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I loved this upon first read, and I do admit I did think that the book dragged on a little bit in certain parts, just like other people do with The Secret History, and I want to return back to this book and sort of fall back into the atmosphere, because I remember relating so much to the unnamed protagonist and her anxieties, and now that I know the plot of the novel and what goes on in the novel, I want to reread it and see if I appreciate it as much as the first read. I also want to reread, controversially, The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I first read this book in 2016, 2015, and it completely devastated me. I thought it was great and wonderful and beautiful. This was my first introduction to proper Greek myth retelling, and it's now the reason why I have so many here on this lower shelf and why I love reading the genre so much. It convinced me to apply for classics courses in university, so I have a lot to thank for this book. However, I do understand that there are criticisms to this book, how it was framed, and how people now look at Greek myth and classics in general, and I want to reread the book and see if it's still as compelling, or if it's just a really good baby's first Greek myth retelling. I also want to reread The Delicate Dependency by Michael Talbot, because I still say that this is my favorite standalone vampire book of all time, and I feel like I should reread it just to confirm that idea. I remember being utterly blown away by the first read. I thought that the writing style was just so perfect for my mental reading speed and cadence. I thought that this just sort of read like butter, like smooth and delicious, and I loved it. And I want to see if I still feel that way with a second read. I also want to reread a book that I just completed recently, These Violent Delights by Mika Nemirever. I don't own a copy, and I really want to because I want to just reread it again. I talked about it being my favorite book that I've read so far this year. I just want it back in my life, and I want it to be in my heart forever. And finally, books that I should reread again. This is my most shameful confession. The Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice. I've only reread the first 3 books. I've only read the other ones once. Am I a true fan, or am I saving my sanity by not delving back into the worst books in the series? Who knows? I know I definitely need to reread them all and give them another shot. So that's it. That's the end of this video. I hope that my weird obsessive ramblings helped convince you to give more books another shot through these different reasons, and I hope that you enjoy any of the books that you decide to reread or give another shot thanks to this video and some of these weird tips, these weird pseudo tips and pseudo explanations that I gave for things. I mostly just wanted to talk about the books that I love to reread and wanted to share them all with you. So let me know books that you love to reread in the comments, reasons why you love to reread books in the comments, and argue with me about the secret history if you want, because I need to know why so many people sort of detest this book outright. Like, why do they hate it so much that they can just talk about it? So let me know all of your thoughts, complaints, and suggestions in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye!